All right, we still got a few people trickling in, but it's time for us to get started this morning. So if we'll be everybody finding their way to a seat, just want to say good morning and express my excitement to be starting a new quarter here. We're starting our quarter on the 4th of July, so I'm counting on you guys to hopefully get a lot out of this session and be ready to fill in everybody who's probably out of town and traveling and stuff. But we're going to be studying Nehemiah this quarter, and it's not a book that I knew super well going into it, and I think it's going to be a really interesting and beneficial study just to spend a little bit longer maybe than we typically would with this book and get into it, and I think you'll be surprised maybe at just how many practical lessons and applications are in here for us. So before we dive into our study, though, let's start with a word of prayer, and I'll lead that for us this morning. Our dear Father, we thank you so much that we have the opportunity to read from your word. Thank you that you've brought the light to us and shown us who you are and the great love that you have for us and given us the opportunity to know you and love you in return. Please help us to give you our very best this morning and each time that we open your word and study, and help us to come to know you more closely and put your word and your spirit in our hearts that we may be more like you. In his name we pray. Amen. Okay, so I did want to start with a show of hands. Who has studied Nehemiah like in an in-depth way before? Okay, that's what I thought. I think there were like 3 maybe, and I would not have raised my own hand for that. I did, when I was in Kentucky, I did one sermon on Nehemiah, and we kind of like walked through the whole book and made like our 3 points, and I thought like, that's great. That's what Nehemiah, like, that's kind of the depth at which I would expect to go through it. Now I got 13 classes, and I told Ryan, like, how am I going to do this? You know, I think maybe I've got a handful of classes, but as I've been getting into it more, and I think as we get into the study, that you're going to see that there is a ton in there for us. When I mention the book of Nehemiah, what like comes to your mind, if anything? What do we know about the book to start off with? Yeah, rebuilding the walls. That's like the central action that happens in the book. Good. What else? The cupbearer. Yeah, so that's Nehemiah's role, that he's a cupbearer to the king, and he kind of uses that position of power to serve God, like similar to what we'd see with Daniel or others who are in the court of the king, Esther. There's kind of some similar stories like that. Anything else? Yeah, that's a good thing. So there's going to be opponents and opposition who come and cause a lot of trouble and try to derail the work and try to prevent the Jews from sort of getting back on their feet. Do you have something?
In chapter 4 where it says the people had a mind to work.
Good, okay. So the people had a mind to work, and that's a type of idea that we're going to talk about a lot, is how do we actually get things done? How do we make a plan and see it through, especially when there's opposition and challenges and reasons not to go forward? Those are good themes. When I was thinking about this and kind of what's the benefit of spending so much time on a book like this, I actually thought of 1 Corinthians chapter 10. And let's kind of all turn over there to 1 Corinthians 10. Probably not the first passage you expected in our Nehemiah class. 1 Corinthians 10. Mark, could I ask you to read chapter 10, verses 1 through 7 for us?
For I do not want you to be unaware, brothers, that our fathers were all under the cloud, and all passed through the sea, and all were baptized into Moses in the cloud and in the sea, and all ate the same spiritual food, and all drank the same spiritual drink. For they drank from the spiritual rock that followed them, and the rock was Christ. Nevertheless, with most of them God was not pleased, for they were overthrown in the wilderness. Now these things took place as examples for us, that we may not desire evil as they did. Do not be idolaters as some of them were, as it is written, the people sat down to eat and drink, and rose up to play.
Okay, so I'm sort of stopping us mid-thought there, but I think you get the idea of where that passage is going. Paul says, think about the Israelites and the time in the wilderness, and recognize the lessons that are given there for us. And especially in verse 6, he says, these things took place as examples for us. And so all of the Old Testament, all of the Bible, but especially I think in the Old Testament, we can read not just as history, not just as events, but as almost a parable of what happened in the story, what's the meaning, what's the message. And when we find ourselves in a situation that has parallels and similarities, we say, what's the example that I can learn from? And he specifically, in verse 7, his example is, don't be idolaters as some of them were, and kind of conjures up the image and the scene of the golden calf. And so when we think about the way that God has communicated his word to us, it could be all instructions, right? It could be all Leviticus, and that's the way that he gave his word, or that's the way that he gave the Old Testament. But so much of it is narrative and story, because that's what stays with us. You know, when I say he references the golden calf, like you've probably got that, and you could tell me what happened with the golden calf and what went wrong and what the lesson is, like even if you haven't read it in a long time. We've got this repertoire of stories that we know from the Bible that we could tell without having the book in front of us and cover most of the major details and cover the lessons, because stories click in our heads and stay with us and give us an ability to kind of put ourselves in the shoes of the characters and map out the lessons. And that's what's going to be happening, I think, for us in Nehemiah. It's a history, it's a narrative, it's a story, but we're going to find that it's a story with a lot of lessons that are very relevant for us today, just like Paul says the golden calf was relevant for the people in the first century. So a couple of my fonts didn't transfer over, but the stories are going to guide our present day walk. And I wanted to just throw up a few of the topics that we're going to be hitting from Nehemiah, just to illustrate what I mean when I say that it's going to be a really practical study. So things like dealing with bad news, the power of prayer, making a plan, confronting opposition. Those were some of the things that we already mentioned. Would you believe there's money issues, and there's status and power and class issues in the book? There is, how do we teach God's word and understand God's word? And we'll spend a class talking about that. We'll talk about worship. We'll talk about what happens when we try to make efforts to rebuild, but yet bad habits and sin crops back up, and how do we address that? And that's just kind of a sampling of some of the things that we'll cover. But I wanted to draw out that this is meant to be a very, very practical class. It's not going to be just history for the sake of history, or so that we can just nail answers to when I ask again at the end of the quarter, what do we know about Nehemiah? You can just come in with 10 good facts. But really, it's meant to be driving us forward in our lives, as all Bible study will. So just in terms of sort of the way we're going to go about the class, we've got textual Bible study and we've got topical Bible study, right? So a lot of our classes are on the textual side. We're going to take a chapter and we're going to walk through it and we're going to make observations from it. Other classes say we're going to address a topic and kind of crisscross around the Bible to flesh out that topic. And I kind of want to do this class in the middle of those two. So each session we're going to have a chapter or two of Nehemiah that I'm going to ask you to read and be prepared to discuss. But I also want to do it like with a topic in mind, to where we make connections. And for instance, next week we're going to do chapter 1, but we're also going to be thinking about prayer more broadly as Nehemiah goes through his prayer. So, what connections can we make to the way that Nehemiah prays? What is the relevance and application for us in that way? So I'll kind of lead us through that, but I just wanted to sort of plant that in your mind, that I think this book is going to lend itself especially well, and we'll have the time to not only look through the book, but also connect into other parts of the Bible and find the relevance with each of these themes. So that's kind of a little bit of why we're going to study Nehemiah and some of the things that we hope to get out of it. What I want to spend the majority of our time today on is doing the setting, the context, the background, kind of everything that we need to know in half an hour to get us ready to read the book and understand it. But before we do that, I have to make a little confession as a teacher. And that is that I don't really like intro classes very much. Sometimes when we're doing an intro class, I kind of feel like we're opening up the encyclopedia a little bit. And this is a shortcoming on my part because I can be a little bit impatient, I will admit. I stared down the microwave this morning as my oatmeal cooked for like 1 minute, and it seemed like it took forever. So I admit to some impatience. But sometimes the intro class, it feels like we've got a lot of great facts and information and history and geography, okay, but sometimes I don't make all the connections into what this actually means for our story. So what I want to do as we go through the setting, the context, the history, is just really encourage you to think about what it will mean in the book, and specifically maybe this morning to think about it in a first-person perspective. So try to sort of remove the 2,500 years that separate us from Nehemiah, and just as we lay out what's happened and where we're going to be jumping into the story, think about what it would feel to be in this era. Think about, as these events transpire, if this was your country, this is your home, these are your people, like what would you be feeling? And maybe just to sort of get into that a little bit more, I'll ask you so that you can teach me a deeper appreciation. What would you say is the benefit of understanding the history and the background and the setting of a Bible book before we just kind of dive in head first? What do you see as the value there? Yeah, excellent. Very good. Kevin?
I always think about kind of the first step for me in understanding any piece of the Bible is like putting myself in the people in the story's position, like trying to feel like what they felt like and experience it and try to have the same thoughts that they would have had. Because if I don't have that, then I'm not able to make those connections to say, well, this is what it means to me now, where I'm at.
Mm-hmm.
And so I like to get the context because it helps me become more, put myself where they're at.
Yeah. Good, good. Anybody else?
We're like in book 7 of Harry Potter right now.
Mm-hmm.
And imagine just like picking up that book 7 and starting to read with none of the background.
Yeah, that's a good analogy. Yeah, I was thinking that the analogy that I was kind of drawing is like, what if we were looking at a primary source from U.S. history? We're going to read somebody's journal entry from a time in the history of the U.S. and what if we just jump straight to the entry and just read it and that's it, and we don't know anything about the background? How informative is that going to be? As Steve said, like, we might actually draw the wrong conclusions. Are we in 1620 Plymouth, Massachusetts at the first Thanksgiving? Are we at 1863 at Gettysburg? Are we 1975? Like, where we are in the context of history and even setting is going to really inform the way that we understand what's going on as we kind of go throughout the study. Ryan's example is good too. We're not starting at book 1. We're starting deep in the middle of the series, and we've already got a setting, and we've got characters, and we've got antagonists, and we've got God's people. And so I want to kind of piece some of those things together for us. I know that our fonts are small here, so I'll help with the reading a little bit, but Jay was nice enough to send me some of the slides of the 17 time periods that the kids are starting in the downstairs class, and I thought it would be good for us to kind of link up a little bit what we're doing with what they're doing. I imagine if you ask them within a few weeks, they're going to be just like rattling these off if they don't already know them. You know, from before the flood, I'll read them since it's a little tiny scrawl here. Flood, scattering of the people, patriarchs, exodus from Egypt, wandering in the wilderness, invasion and conquest of Canaan, judges, united kingdom, divided kingdom, Judah alone, captivity, return from captivity, years of silence, life of Christ, early church, and letters to Christians. So that's the 17 kind of time periods that the Bible covers. Does anybody know where we're going to be zooming in for our Nehemiah study? 13, yeah. Very good. You get the big green arrow. Return from captivity. I blew that one up a little bit so you could see our guy Nehemiah there on the right with his building tools ready to go to work. I think we've got Esther, Zerubbabel leading people back. So as I was making my slides yesterday, just so you know, I had this feeling that there weren't enough cartoons in them, so I had to interject some art. But I do think that these are the kind of things that the kids are going to be studying, and I think it's nice to intersect with them a little bit and sort of be speaking the same language. And something that's cool about these flashcards that the kids will have access to is that the characters are drawn the same in every scene so that they can kind of be traced as they appear throughout the Bible story. So every time that Nehemiah is going to pop up in the material, he's going to be in this purple robe holding his building tool so that it can kind of be picked up on who he is and what he's doing. But for our purposes, we're in the return from captivity era, and I'll put a more academic chart on the board so we can return to a serious, deep study and not get too distracted by adorable cartoons. Again, I know my font's a little small here, but this is just to sort of get us triangulated on where we are in history. So we're starting at the era of the United Kingdom. Saul, David, and Solomon, success and prosperity for Israel. Then we have the kingdom splinter into Israel, which is taken down by Assyria. Our focus is going to be down here on Judah, which survives in the Judah alone era that we were talking about in our flashcards until 606 when Babylonia comes in, and then the people are taken into captivity for 70 years, and eventually they have the opportunity to return to the land in different waves. One's under Zerubbabel, and then Ezra leads people back, and then Nehemiah leads people back. So just to think about where we are in the Bible story, Nehemiah is one of the very last Old Testament books, which I actually didn't realize for a while going into it, just because of where it's laid out in the Old Testament. It's kind of like towards the beginning, middle of the Old Testament. But if you think of all of the history books of the Old Testament, it's right there at the end. So we've got 1st and 2nd Kings, 1st and 2nd Chronicles, which ends with the people being taken into captivity, and then Ezra, Nehemiah, Esther, things that happen after the people have been taken into captivity. We're actually looking in the year, what do we have on the chart? 444 BC, roughly, for Nehemiah, so only about 400 years before Jesus, and about 600 years after David. So we're far along in the history of the Jewish to where they've prospered, they've risen, they've fallen, and now they're coming back slowly but surely. Let's go over to 2nd Chronicles chapter 36 just to get a little bit more focus in on kind of what is happening in this era. 2nd Chronicles 36. Dave, could I ask you to read 2nd Chronicles 36, 15 through 21?
36, 15 through 21. The Lord, the God of their fathers, sent persistently to them by his messengers, because he had compassion on his people and on his dwelling place. But they kept scoffing at his prophets, until the wrath of the Lord rose against his people, until there was no remedy. Therefore he brought up against them the king of the Chaldeans, who killed their young men with the sword in the house of their sanctuary, and had no compassion on young man or virgin, old man or aged. He gave them all into his hand, and all the vessels of the house of God, great and small, and the treasures of the house of the Lord, and the treasures of the king and his princes. All of these he brought to Babylon. And they burned the house of God, and broke down the wall of Jerusalem, and burned all its palaces with fire, and destroyed all its precious vessels. He took into exile in Babylon those who had escaped from the sword. They became servants to him and to his sons until the establishment of the kingdom of Persia, to fulfill the word of the Lord by the mouth of Jeremiah, until the land had enjoyed its Sabbaths. All the days that it lay desolate, it kept Sabbath to fulfill 70 years.
Thank you. Okay, so remember we said we're going to take a first-person approach here. So what do you observe? What do you feel as we read through that of the people being taken into captivity? What stood out to you? Yeah, complete destruction. I mean, it calls out that there's no compassion on anyone, even young or old, whoever they were. They're being taken. What else? Yeah, right.
With your chart up there, the very first thing that it starts with in verse 15, that God sent persistently to them, especially when you look at the chart, God was awfully patient before he finally did something about it.
Yeah, originally I was going to start in verse 17, but I just noticed those two verses before of just reminding us that God pleaded and pleaded and pleaded and gave so many messengers and chances. And by the time we get to Babylonian captivity, the people have no one to blame but themselves. And God has given them every chance, and they just aren't really interested in hearing what he has to say. What other observations? I mean, it's probably so obvious, but I mean, what do you feel what's the national mood? What's the feeling if you're around at this moment in time?
Defeat.
Yeah, defeat. I mean, it's defeat all the way to devastation. There's nothing left. In verse 19, that's an important verse for us to make sure we see. They burned the house of God, the temple, and they broke down the wall of Jerusalem and burned all its palaces. So that right there, that's our context for Ezra and Nehemiah. We burned down the house of God, we have a temple that needs rebuilt, and we have a wall that needs rebuilt. Because Jerusalem is just lying in ruin. It's a wasteland. It's nothing. And that's in 586. Our book happens 140 years later. We're still trying to put the pieces back together. At that point, when we zoom in on Nehemiah, the temple is back, but the wall is not, and the city is really just a shell of its former self. I want us to go over to Psalm 137, because that's written at kind of the era of Babylonian captivity, and we think about the devastation and what it would have been like to have the label of we're the people of God. We belong to him. We have his temple. Think about even in New Testament times how much pride and identity the Jews took in that, right? We are the sons of Abraham. And what does it mean for that group to get carried off and belong to a foreign power? We read the prose, but I think it's actually maybe even better in poetry form of what the people were feeling. So I'm going to read Psalm 137 and then ask for your observations about it to kind of capture what the people are feeling. Psalm 137, by the waters of Babylon, there we sat and wept when we remembered Zion. On the willows there we hung up our lyres, for there our captors required of us songs, and our tormentors mirth, saying, sing us one of the songs of Zion. How shall we sing the Lord's song in a foreign land? If I forget you, O Jerusalem, let my right hand forget its skill. Let my tongue stick to the roof of my mouth if I do not remember you, if I do not set Jerusalem above my highest joy. Remember, O Lord, against the Edomites the day of Jerusalem, how they said, lay it bare, down to its foundations. O daughter of Babylon, doomed to be destroyed. Blessed shall be he who repays you with what you have done to us. Blessed shall be he who takes your little ones and dashes them against the rock. It's pretty hard-hitting stuff. What does that psalm conjure up? What stands out to you as we read that? Luke?
They're pretty crushed.
Absolutely.
So, I mean, you read that section in First Chronicles. Babylonians are kind of savage. Well, they're savage. So the young ones are killed, the old ones are killed. There's no future, there's no past.
Mm-hmm.
Politically, you're taken down. Your palaces burn down. Religiously, you're cut down. Your temples burn. Militarily, you're destroyed. Your walls burn down. So what is there?
Yeah. Well said. And I think it's hard for us almost as we try to do this first-person exercise. If we've lived in America our whole lives, we've never been part of anything remotely close to this. We've had difficult moments, and you could think maybe of like a 9/11 or something, but we've never been remotely close to brought to our knees the way that these people are. Like you said, they have nothing left, and they're carried off and just totally at the mercy of foreign captors who are merciless. Yeah.
Well, I think they're probably wondering, where's God in all of this?
Yes.
Has he just totally forsaken us?
Yep. I'm very glad that you brought that up, because you think about the Old Testament system, the worship and the relationship with God was very much wrapped up in a physical place, right? So there's the tabernacle, and then there's the temple, and there's the altar and the priestly system, and all of that happens in a spot where the people come to commune with God. If we're 1,000 miles away in Babylonia, where is God? And where is our relationship with him? And what does that look like? I love the way that it's tragic, but in verses 1 and 2, they're sitting by the waters of Babylon weeping, and it pictures them like hanging up their musical instrument on the tree branch and just saying, we don't have any songs. There's no joy in my heart. Where is a song to the Lord going to come from? And the people of Babylon are taunting them, and they say, sing us one of your songs, perform for us. Like they're just reminding them of their lowliness and how despised they are. And the poet says, like in verse 4, how shall we sing the Lord's song in a foreign land? And I think it's important for us to try to wrap our minds around that, of just the level of heartache and heartbreak that would have come from this, because when we fast forward 140 years, there's a temptation as a modern reader and without all of the setting to say, what are these people doing? Why was the wall not built up a long time ago and Jerusalem repopulated and they had the opportunity to go back? And you would expect that things would be a little bit further along than they are, at least I would. And it's worth us, I think, feeling what they felt and seeing the low state that they were brought to, and as well as understanding that only kind of trickles of the people are going to make it back to the promised land. This idea of a remnant. It's never going to be what it was under Saul, David, and Solomon, of a big, huge, thriving kingdom. It is, at this point in history, a ragtag bunch of people who have made the effort to go back and start to rebuild, but they're so far from where they once were, and I think that continually sort of is on their mind. Other thoughts that you have, or feelings or observations as we kind of put ourselves in the mind of the people right here?
Just an overall,
Mm-hmm.
one of the things in history is that when a nation is conquered and is taken captive, it is absorbed into that community. Where God, in this instance, the nation, God's people, in history, they're the only ones ever to have returned back, who have maintained who they are
Mm-hmm.
and maintained where they were.
Yeah.
At least as a people and an identity. So I think that's just always impressed me about God and his effort for his people.
Yeah, Very good observation. So even though they like get reduced down to this kind of smoldering wick, the flame is not put out, and it's not the end. And that you can only attribute that to the providence of God, because they weren't a nation. They had no strength. They had no might. They had no ability to go back and take their land. But what we're going to see in just a moment is that God works through a Persian king and grants them return, and just basically hands it to them and allows the people to go back. And that kind of takes us where we're headed, which is the book of Ezra. And I couldn't resist putting Ezra up on the slide as well. But Ezra leads up to Nehemiah not only in just the pages of our Bible, but the two books are really closely linked. So to kind of finish up our history, I think it's useful to look at Ezra and see how he sets the stage for what's coming with Nehemiah. In Ezra 1 through 6, what Ezra does is basically look back at the history of how did the people get back into the land. So Ezra 1 through 6, he's not writing a first-person account like we think of with Ezra and Nehemiah of, I came in and I did this. He's actually sort of continuing the chronicle story of, okay, we got taken into captivity, how did we get back to where we're headed? And so like in Ezra 1 and verses 1 and 2, in the first year of Cyrus, king of Persia, that the word of the Lord by the mouth of Jeremiah might be fulfilled, the Lord stirred up the spirit of Cyrus, king of Persia, so that he made a proclamation throughout all his kingdom and also put in writing, thus says Cyrus, king of Persia, the Lord, the God of heaven, has given me all the kingdoms of the earth, and he's charged me to build him a house at Jerusalem, which is in Judah. So Ezra spends the first 6 chapters of his book saying, here's how the rebuilding effort came about. And we have to notice that it was a Persian king. So people got taken into Babylonian captivity. During those 70 years, the Babylonians fade, the Persians become the world power. And the Persians have a more benevolent attitude that kind of says, we're willing to allow people to live where they want to live, worship how they want to worship, in order to keep them under our rule and maybe have them a little bit more content and less likely to rebel. But we can see God's providence and plan in that. And so Cyrus says, you can go back, you can rebuild. A group starts to do that. I've got listed on the slide there, it's sometimes called a second Exodus, because we've got people in bondage. They are far from the promised land. They're under the thumb of a powerful foreign ruler, and they get granted their release. And they say, you can go back, you can be God's people, you can build. In the end of chapter 1, we see that they actually, Cyrus and company, supply the Jews with their supplies. They give them gold and silver and equipment and the things that they're going to need to rebuild the temple, which really conjures up Exodus, right? Like, not only can you go back, but here's the stuff you need. And we think, how would anyone have chosen to do that? And I think we see God's hand working behind the scenes to build the people back up, to give them a chance. So they have this second Exodus. I do want us to read chapter 3, starting in verse 10. This is Ezra's account of the temple being rebuilt. Chapter 3. Tim, would you mind to read for us Ezra 3, 10 through 13?
And when the builders laid the foundations of the temple of the Lord, the priests in their vestments came forward with trumpets, and the Levites, son of Asaph, with cymbals to praise the Lord, according to the directions of David, king of Israel. And they sang responsively, praising and giving thanks to the Lord, for he is good, for his steadfast love endures forever towards Israel. And all the people shouted with a great shout when they praised the Lord, because the foundation of the house of the Lord was laid. But many of the priests and Levites and heads of the fathers' houses, old men who had seen the first house, wept with a loud voice when they saw the foundation of this house being laid, though they shouted aloud for joy, so that the people could not distinguish the sound of the joyful shout from the sound of the people's weeping. For the people shouted with a great shout, and the sound was heard far away.
Thank you. This might be the perfect place to understand what this era is like. So they lay the foundation of the temple again. It's exciting. It's joyous. You're picturing yourself there. You hear the shouts of joy. And here we go, and it's wonderful. And what's that you also hear? But people are weeping. Right? The old heads who had seen the previous temple just can't hold themselves back from weeping. This just isn't anything like what we had before. What a blessing that we get to go back, and it is exciting, and it is joyous, and here's the house of God, but it's not Solomon's temple. And I think in that depiction, we kind of get a sense of what life in 450 BC Jerusalem is like. Now, this takes place a little bit before the events of Nehemiah, but it captures the spirit, and it's important because it's kind of the parallel to building the wall that we're going to see in Nehemiah. Here's the building of the temple. It's great, it's a victory, it's a success eventually, but it's also not the full restoration. And I want to go ahead and put that out as a theme that I think we're going to trace and see more, is this idea of Ezra and Nehemiah, and we'll focus on Nehemiah, are restorers, but they don't bring it all the way to what God had in mind. And that's not even as a representation of their shortcomings. It's just realizing the fact that God has a greater restoration in mind than laying the temple and rebuilding the wall. One thing that I think is interesting, I didn't get to study this in depth, so maybe you can think about this and we can discuss it more. I'll just present it as an idea. You don't see recorded in this temple that the glory of the Lord comes and fills it, like we saw with the first temple and like we saw with the tabernacle. And so I think God's stamp of approval is on this work, but it's almost as though he's saying, keep looking, keep striving for something better, because getting back in the land, they're rebuilding, but is this all that God had in mind ultimately? Or is he sort of laying the groundwork for further restorations 400 years later, setting the stage so that there is a Jerusalem, there is a people of God that Jesus can then come and be the true reformer of? The rest of the book of Ezra talks about the building of the temple. One thing is that the people run into some serious opposition, which we're going to see crop up again in Nehemiah. So as soon as they start to make some progress, the Jews aren't the only ones in the promised land anymore. Even back in the conquest time, there were some foreigners kind of floating around who they didn't drive out, but now the Jews have come to resettle their land, but other people have moved in, and they're not too happy with the Jews making progress. And so they try to derail the building of the temple, just like they'll later try to get in the way of building the wall. And they actually succeed for a long time. Chapters 4 and 5 of Ezra detail this, that they slander the Jews. They say, these people are trying to rebel. You need to stop the building of the wall, Persians. And the Persians say, okay. And the Jews just kind of hang their head. And the work stops for many years until in chapter 5, stir the people up. They say, no, we got to have a temple. I need you to show some persistence and some backbone. We need to rebuild. And so it finally happens, but only through a lot of opposition, which we're going to see again in the book of Nehemiah. Once we have a temple in Ezra 7 through 10, Ezra is of the priestly line. He's actually of the high priestly line coming from Aaron. And so he takes it on himself and was tasked by God to teach the law to the people. And so in chapter 7 through 10, we start to have a religious restoration. We've got a temple. We need to have good worship. We need to understand the law. We need to be going back to those things. And a lot of what Ezra talks about, which is our last bullet on the slide, is the need to get out of intermarriages with people from the land. So it's a message of distinctiveness and holiness. And we've got to be God's people again. And we can't be part God's people and part people of the land. We can't be unequally yoked. And he challenges them to split themselves off from these ungodly marriages. And the book ends with the people promising to do that and saying, we are going to be God's people. We are going to go in his way. But it's not totally clear just how deeply these reforms are going to take root. And we'll see, this ends Ezra, Nehemiah picks up 12 years later, and it doesn't seem like in those 12-year interim that the people have been on fire for God, doing everything right. At the end of the book of Nehemiah, he's going to confront intermarriages between the Israelites or the Jews and the non-Jews again. So we're faced with this dilemma again of we're reforming, we're rebuilding, we're restoring, but there's also something greater. It's also not the complete, full, final, everybody gets it together restoration that's talked about in the prophets. Jeremiah 31, for instance, Jeremiah promises a new era and a new people of God and a new restoration. And I think you look at this era and you think the people were hoping for that and they were trying to build toward that. Well how it would feel to live in Nehemiah's day. In our last couple minutes, we've touched on the place and date of where we are about 400 years before the start of the New Testament in Persia, but mostly in Jerusalem for our setting. The actual author of the book is not known, and you may say, I'm pretty sure it's Nehemiah. But what we see is a first-person account from Nehemiah, but also it looks like there's some history that has been compiled on. And so a lot of people think that the book was put together by the same historian who wrote 1st and 2nd Chronicles and Ezra. Or it may have been written directly, exclusively by Nehemiah. But I think the point that we'll see is that this is Nehemiah's story. It's his first-person account, regardless of who was sort of the final pen to put it to paper. In terms of a very simple outline of the book of Nehemiah, I like this one because it's 3 points, and that's all that I can remember for an outline. I saw some awesome outlines that had like 17 points and 14 subdivisions of all of those, but if you want to just know where we're going in Nehemiah, this breaks it down by Nehemiah's 3 roles. First 2 chapters, he's the cupbearer to the king, like Tim talked about. In the middle, he's the builder of the wall, chapters 2 through 6. And then after the wall's built, in the later half of the book, Nehemiah serves as the governor of the people. So we can kind of think of the book in those ways. He starts in the Persian court, he gets called back to Jerusalem and builds in the middle, and then at the end, he's the governor trying to help the people really get on track, make sure that they come back to the Lord and come back to the law. We'll talk more about themes next time, but I'd encourage you to read through the book and see what themes stand out to you. We've touched on a couple of them, like working through opposition, like God working through worldly rulers, like God's patience and faithfulness. And one thing that I want you to think about, that I put the star on at the bottom, is whether this book is of great leadership and in praise of great leadership, or which is kind of how it's traditionally viewed, and I think that's there, or whether it's maybe about when even a good leader can't take you as far as you want to go, and the need for leader-follower alignment, and everyone to be of one heart and one accord, because some of what I see in this book is Nehemiah is pulling, but the people aren't necessarily going with him. So, Jay, you're good to ring the buzzer, but for next time here, I'd like you to read Nehemiah 1, and if you get a chance, read the whole book, and just be thinking about the state of the city walls and the prayer of Nehemiah. I'm going to try to put together just like 1 or 2 or 3 max questions for each class, just so you know kind of where we're going. I'm going to send them to Ryan and ask him to shoot those out in the Friday email, so that you have a chance just to know what's coming up and come prepared, come with thoughts and comments and questions. So thank you all for your participation. Looking forward to the class.